Great, so that really was a terrific lead-in to this session, which is going to be on cities, but also on transportation infrastructure. And I'll really be talking about both. You guys can hear me okay? Even if I lean back a little bit? That's great. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about actually a body of work. It'll be focused on one paper in particular on rural roads and its effect on labor markets in India. But I'll talk a bit about the impacts of roads on education as well as some new work that we're doing with Karan Nagpal, who's a PhD student of mine at Oxford, on the cost of remoteness and what it means to be further away from cities, and in particular this concept of administrative remoteness, and how cities aren't just centers of high productivity and exchange of goods and of labor, but also provide services to rural areas. But let's dive right in. So, one of the things that we're coming to understand is that developing countries are urbanizing very, very rapidly, some less rapidly than we might hope, like India. But there are many differences between the old urbanization that rich countries went through, and the currently rich countries, and the newer urbanization that's taking place in developing countries. A lot of this work is actually coming out of sub-Saharan Africa, but and there's some important differences with other parts of the world. But just to kind of give you a few examples, one is the example of urbanization without industrialization that's happening across sub-Saharan Africa, where many countries, the size of the urban population is growing enormously without major growth in the manufacturing sector. Urbanization is often in many countries outstripping growth. Not the case in India. Actually, in India, growth is outstripping urbanization. And that when you look around the world, actually, in some places it looks like the spatial equilibrium may really not hold. That, for example, in India, local productivity in terms of wages and other measures doesn't track very well with city size, that more people don't seem to be flowing into the most productive places at the rates that we might expect. There's a lot of work in economics on the causes of urbanization, both the push and the pull. The push from rural areas, the pull from higher productivity in urban areas. But actually in this talk, I'll be talking about actually how cities spill out into those rural areas, and how rural areas are affected by their linkages with higher productivity urban areas. So just for a bit of motivation, here's, we're comparing average wages in rural and urban areas at the district level, and basically what you can see here is two things. One, there's a very, very strong relationship between rural and urban wages. The red line is the 45-degree line. That's not a misplaced regression line. So what you can see is obviously there's a very strong relationship between rural and urban wages. They track very closely. But also that urban wages are almost always higher than rural wages. I mean, in this case, in the averages, they're always higher. When you look across India, they're almost always higher. And so this really kind of motivates some of what we're looking at here, which is, given these persistent large rural-urban wage gaps, why is it that so many people are working, living in rural areas, and in particular in the agricultural sector? And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about in this paper. But let me just kind of establish a few things before we get into that particular paper. So for the one thing, although we think that cities and their rural hinterlands are linked in many, many ways, their economic destinies are going to be shared, in fact, that isn't necessarily the case. When you have open economy cities that are trading with the entire world, they're not necessarily dependent on their rural hinterlands. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need to get from these rural areas either agricultural goods, which is how we've usually thought about these things, or labor or anything else, because these cities are connected with the world and can trade with many other places other than just the nearby rural areas. We understand relatively little about this urban growth to rural growth channel. We think that cities are drivers of growth. We talk about this a lot. We know that they're much higher productivity than the rural areas, but we don't understand very well what exactly is that relationship. How is it mediated? What is the driving force that translates higher productivity growth in urban areas into rural poverty alleviation? Migration is one channel for that, but there are likely to be other channels for all of the people who, for various reasons, are staying behind in rural areas. And so, here I'm going to be talking about three different channels, though focusing on numbers 2 and 3. First is obviously good markets. Cities and their nearby rural areas trade a lot of goods. Agriculture is going to be primary among them, but there are a lot of other goods there. Second is labor markets. This is something we actually don't understand very well in most developing countries, and I think particularly in India, the data are quite bad. Temporary migration, commuting, circular migration, these are all major phenomena that are generally not very well explored, or I think served by policy. And so just one data set that we're working with shows that well over half of all households send one form of a migrant or another from rural areas, and these are mostly going into urban areas. And the third is really that cities provide goods to the government goods to rural areas. Cities are generally administrative centers as well as being centers of other sorts of markets. And so understanding that relationship and how these goods get served from the cities to the neighboring rural areas is, I think, important if we're going to improve the policies. Okay, so I'll talk about 3 papers here. The first one is going to be the labor market impacts of rural road construction. I know I've talked a lot about cities, but the fact is I'll now be talking mostly about rural areas and really their connections to cities. And in this we're going to be looking at the largest rural road construction program in history, India's Prime Minister Village Road Program. So the first one's going to look at labor markets and the role that roads play in facilitating the flow of labor. The second paper actually is relatively new. I'll just have a slide on it, but I think it's important to include here in saying that, look, investments like infrastructure are going to have immediate short-term effects on goods markets, on labor markets, but the long-run growth consequences, which we're generally very, very poor at measuring, are actually quite likely to come from the longer-run investments that are made that are going to have very long lag times between the investments that are made and the payoffs, right? And human capital is probably the best example of that. Decisions that are made now, and if we're changing even relatively small decisions in how much human capital people are accumulating, are likely to pay off for just decades and decades. It means we're not going to be able to measure it very well, but if we can pick up on the investments and actually measure the investments, then we're going to have some sense of additional returns from these things. And the third is, as I said, the costs of administrative remoteness and how things change in rural areas as you get further away from administrative centers. This is challenging work to do. Doing work at this spatial scale requires that you have a huge number of cities and rural areas. We know that there are a lot of policies that are going to be affecting all of these things, and so in order to kind of pick these things apart, you're going to need a very large sample size. You need consistent data over space and time, and you need exogenous variation in the linkages between rural and urban areas, and that's what, thankfully, each of these papers we've managed to at least partially solve these problems. I always like to make the pitch, maybe I don't need to make it to this audience because this is specifically an India conference, but I like to make the pitch for working on India, that we have these things, we have the huge size, we have 8,000 cities, we have 600,000 villages, each of which can be treated as its own little partially open economy, right? The Indian government has been collecting somewhat consistent data for a very long time, and that we think is consistent across the entire country. And actually now it's even possible, I'm working with some people in the Indian government, to geocode data not just across all of these villages and cities, but actually within cities in India, which has generally been a very, very difficult thing to do, and I hope at the very end of this talk to circle back to that and the kind of promise of understanding intra-urban issues. We talk a lot about city policies, we don't understand actually what's going on with these intra-urban issues. Okay, just to give a quick data snapshot so you guys kind of understand what I'm talking about. We've, over the last 6 years, my co-author Paul Novosad and I have spent far too much time and money stitching together various different Indian censuses. So we have the population census. The economic census is actually an enumeration of every non-farm economic establishment in the country, 40 million in 2005. 2012 one hopefully will be out soon. As well as socioeconomic censuses. So we've put together both the BPL, the Below Poverty Line Census from 2002, as well as the socioeconomic and caste census from 2012. And that's microdata on what's supposed to be every single person in the country. It was actually based off of the population census, the National Population Register. And we put that together for all of both rural and urban India. And absolutely critically is that it's geocoded at the town and village level. And this is what's going to allow us to do a lot of our analysis. Okay, paper 1. Roads and structural transformation. So this paper starts out with the question of why do so many people in low-income countries work in agriculture? Now, this is something that, as an economist, I would be agnostic to, which jobs people prefer to take, what sector they prefer to work in. I'm perfectly fine with whatever choice they make, except that we actually think that a lot of money is being left on the table, and that their poverty is much higher and productivity is much lower overall because of the number of people working in agriculture. So it's been quite well documented that there are these large and persistent agricultural productivity gaps. Basically, the very same person, I, Sam Asher, am more productive when working out of agriculture than I am in agriculture. Okay? And for India, the estimates are actually that the same person would be 2 to 3 times more productive, would earn wages 2 to 3 times higher if they worked out of agriculture instead of in agriculture. And the second fact is not only are these gaps very large and highest in developing countries, but the share of the population working in agriculture and sort of foregoing those gains of reallocation are also highest in developing countries, right? So in India, 50% of the workforce is still in agriculture. And in the US, that number is 1.5%, despite having some of the highest agricultural productivity in the world. And so what we're hypothesizing in this paper is that the poor state of rural transportation infrastructure is really a major constraint on the ability of households, of workers to reallocate from the agricultural sector into the non-agricultural wage work sector. Around the world, this is a big deal. 1 billion people, many of them in India, lack paved road access. Arguably, if you took quality into account, that number would be even higher. The Indian government has made a lot of progress on road construction, both of major highways that tend to get a lot of the attention, like the Golden Quadrilateral, but also in terms of rural roads. And so since 1991, the percentage of villages with paved roads has gone up from just barely a third to over half. But obviously there's a lot of room for improvement. And there's huge variance state by state. The southern states are almost all 80 to 90%, and the northern states are generally far, far below. The way we're going to test this hypothesis is by looking at the labor market impacts of this massive rural road program, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. The impact, of course, is theoretically ambiguous. It could be that roads actually cause the villages that receive them to specialize in agriculture. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it means that roads aren't actually what are preventing people from moving out of agriculture, right? It may be that agriculture is the comparative advantage of these villages, and as transportation costs fall, that's exactly what they specialize in. It also may be that roads are not the binding constraint on the reallocation of labor in rural areas. It may be that in the absence of electricity, in the absence of skills, of human capital, that there are a lot of other things going on, and that roads are not going to be enough to move the needle much. So this is sort of to motivate this particular paper. What you can see here is the share of households that are earning their primary source of income from agriculture. And what you can see is that as you go further away from cities, 0 means that you're at a city. As you move further away from cities, the share of households in agriculture goes way up, especially in that first about 40 kilometers straight line distance from major cities. The share of households earning in agriculture goes from about 20% to nearly 40%. The second thing that you can see is that having a road is sort of the equivalent of being about 10 kilometers closer to the city than not having a road. Okay? And then basically these lines are in parallel, if not for that. So the challenge here is twofold to do this kind of research. One, road placement is endogenous. It's very, very hard to study transportation infrastructure. Remy, I think you appreciate this as well. Because governments put roads where they want to. And they put them where there's political favor, and that means that road investments are likely to be very correlated with other investments, but also they put them where it's economically promising. And so they put it where the returns are the highest. And that's probably a very good thing from policymaking, but for the econometrician, it's a real problem. And so we're going to overcome that by taking advantage of program rules that I'll explain in a minute that are going to give us exogenous variation. The second is data availability, and as I've already explained, we have data at the level of every single village, so we can compare villages that do and don't get roads. And that's impossible if you use the various Indian data sets like the Annual Survey of Industries, the National Sample Survey, or others that are only ever available at the district level. So let me tell you about the program for a minute. Only 10 minutes. All right, let me accelerate also. So the program was started in 2000. The goal is to connect all villages to the road network. By 2015, nearly $40 billion has been dispersed. 100,000 villages have been connected with roads. And thankfully, they have this transparent record-keeping system that we take advantage of. The most important thing here is the prioritization. Villages over 1,000 population were prioritized to those 500 to 999 population, which were prioritized over villages under 500. Okay? What that's going to do is give us jumps in the probability of receiving a road around the 1,000 and 500 population thresholds that we're going to use to estimate the causal effects of these roads. Basically, you gain 15 percentage points in the likelihood of having gotten a road by 2012 if you're just to the right of the cutoffs than if you're just to the left of the cutoffs. And that's really going to be the whole empirical strategy here. So here's the paper in a nutshell. Here's two villages in northeast Rajasthan, similar in every way. They both have primary schools, neither one has a medical center. They're both nominally electrified, except Chori Kanangla has a population just over 500, whereas Mundia has a population just under 500. And basically everyone's working in agriculture as of 2001. Fast forward 11 years to 2012, the village whose population was just over 500 has gotten a road. 5 years previously, the village who was deprioritized did not. And what we see is a much larger fall in the share of people working in agriculture in the village that got a road. Okay? If you take away nothing else from this presentation, this is exactly what's happening here. What we see is basically that this is happening. The actual estimate, that was a cherry-picked example. The actual estimate is 10 percentage point decrease. We find that you build a road into a village, there's a 10 percentage point decrease in the share of workers in agriculture and the share of households gaining their primary source of income from agriculture. Okay? There's a really big drop following the construction of these roads. And basically everyone's going into manual labor. Okay? This is not about starting new businesses. This is not about becoming lawyers and doctors. This is about relatively low-skilled farmers going and taking relatively low-skilled positions as manual laborers in other sectors. Other data sets suggest that construction is likely a sector that's soaking up a lot of this labor. And I should say that this is going to be somewhat context specific. The fact is that India is booming right now. India's cities are growing very, very fast. A lot of new buildings are going up, and it's exactly in this context that so many people, once they're connected to the outside world, are able to actually move out of agriculture and into other sectors. We don't find migration effects. Okay? There's growing evidence that roads can have an effect on migration. We actually don't find that, and I don't think that we should be surprised. These are relatively short roads. They're 4 kilometers long. They're connecting you to the nearest road. This is not going to change your long-term consideration of do I move into the city on a permanent basis or not. What these are really changing is the ability of people to come and go from the village. Okay? This is high frequency kind of stuff rather than the permanent decision to pick up my whole family and move them into Delhi or something. We do find that this is associated with gains to economic incomes. Our best estimates are at about the same magnitude, about a 10 percentage point increase in earnings overall, as well as in the likelihood that your house is made of solid materials, solid roof and walls. Within the village, we find evidence that the highest effects are for those that we actually think have the lowest opportunity cost of leaving agriculture. Within village, non-farm firms grow up, right? Now the village is connected to the outside world. I can start firms making rugs, trading all kinds of other things that weren't possible to do before in the village, and now people are going to work in those firms in the village. We find no evidence for that whatsoever. There's no growth in business in the villages as a result of building these roads. If anything, actually, fewer households are earning their income from businesses than before. Okay, so people are getting out of that too. It's not just agriculture. It's not just self-employment in agriculture that people are getting out of. It's self-employment more generally that people are getting out of once they're connected to external wage markets, labor markets. The second is access to external labor markets, and that's exactly what we find the most evidence for. It's driven by places close to the cities. It's driven by places where there are transportation linkages. Bus routes grow in exactly these areas where people are getting out of agriculture in a big way. And it's happening in exactly the areas where the wage gaps between the rural areas and the urban areas are the highest. Okay, so it's not happening. We find effects that we can't differentiate from zero in the areas where the wage gaps are relatively small. Where there isn't much difference between the wages I'm making now and the wages I'll make in the city, when there isn't much difference to arbitrage, I don't move sectors. I stay in agriculture. When there is a big difference, that's exactly when I go and enter the labor market. Okay? All right, so let's try to get through these other couple ones. One slide on education. As I said, the long-run impacts of a lot of these investments, and it could be infrastructure, it could be other issues, the long-run impacts are very likely to be hard to pick up in the short run, right? Many investments are going to have very, very long time lags. Education is one of them. So when we see that earnings are going up by 10% a few years after you build a road, we're probably not capturing anything close to the actual economic impacts of building this road. Putting aside the fact that many of the impacts are going to accrue to places like the cities that these villages are now connected to, right? So in this paper, we focus on education in particular. We put together really detailed data on enrollment by year, by school. And what I should say, the overall evidence on openness and education is quite mixed. There are quite a few papers out there that show that when you get connected to external markets, that actually education can go down. That kids go more, kids drop out and go to take jobs now that jobs pay more. Sometimes that seems to be the case, as David Atkin found in Mexico. sometimes not. What we find here is actually the impact of building a road is quite positive for education. At that crucial first big wave of dropout in 5th grade, as you go from 5th to 6th grade in India, there's much lower dropout when you build a road into a village. And the heterogeneity, I think, really speaks to what's going on here. So basically we have a model where, on the one hand, you build a road, there are now higher wages to make on the outside, and so I might be interested in dropping out. On the other hand, the long-run returns to education have probably changed as well, because now I can enter the labor market and take jobs that weren't available before I had this road. There's an additional potential channel, which is that liquidity constraints, credit constraints for families who want to make these investments but don't have the short-run capital to do so may be eased. And our evidence, I can point you to the paper, kind of suggests that all of these are at work, but at the end of the day, the long-run returns to education are swamping the short-run interests of families to pull their kids out of school to work. Last paper here. So both of these other papers are thinking about this concept of remoteness and how, when you build a road, it's sort of effectively bringing you closer to the city, bringing you closer to the returns to education that there are in cities, bringing you closer to the labor markets that there are in cities, and making it easier to enter those labor markets. But as I've said, cities are also administrative centers, and the ability of villages to gain access to the various goods and services that the city governments provide, or governments based in the cities provide, is a big deal when we have, nearly half of the villages in India that don't have a road, large share that aren't electrified, and the electricity often doesn't flow even when they are technically electrified. And so here we're asking the question of, well, what is this cost of administrative remoteness? This has largely been dealt with in the political science literature and showing how state capacity attenuates as you go further away from cities. But the challenge is to isolate the impact of remoteness from administration from the other penalties of remoteness, right? We know that from some other work that I've done, that incomes drop enormously as you move away from cities, literacy rates drop as you move away from cities, everything gets worse as you move away from cities. But that could be because of the lack of labor market linkages with cities, that could be because of problems in goods markets and the difficulty of trading goods with urban areas that are higher productivity, but it could also be this administrative channel. And so what we do here, let me just skip ahead, is basically compare villages that are right next to each other, that basically have access to the same goods markets, that have access to the same labor markets, but have access to different government markets, okay? That's an awkward way of saying. What I mean is, some of them have extremely high administrative remoteness because the particular district that they're in, the capital or the headquarters happens to be very, very far away. And just over the border, the sister village right next door, the district headquarters is very nearby. Okay? And so this is exactly what you see here in Khammam and Krishna districts in AP. What you see is these villages are right next to each other, just a few kilometers apart. We really focus in on these lines. But one, the district headquarters is 20 kilometers away, the other one is 100 kilometers away. And this is effectively what our comparison is doing here. Okay? We throw a lot of controls at it. Let me just give you the results and then we'll wrap up. Throw a lot of controls at it, and basically what we find is your likelihood of having a road goes way down when you're administratively remote. Your likelihood of having a secondary school goes way down when you're administratively remote. And this ends up really adding up. So what you see here is that for every additional kilometer of distance away from an administrative center, you're losing about 2 rupees of income per month. Okay? And given that incomes here are in the range of about 5,000 rupees per month, like going an extra 100 kilometers adds up to a couple hundred rupees of lost income, and that's really significant. And it shows up in other outcomes as well. Can I take 1 minute, Remy, and wrap up? Sure. Great. Okay, yeah, let's do this one. So, a couple of things. First, transportation infrastructure moves far more than just goods. I think the way, transportation infrastructure has primarily been in the domain of trade economists, and they've made huge amounts of progress in understanding it. But transport infrastructure moves labor, which actually puts us much more in an urban economics kind of framework than we normally are used to thinking about these things. And it also moves government services. The state also faces transportation costs. And this kind of introduces a second idea, which is actually that there may be very large complementarities between different investments made by the state, with major implications for the optimal sequencing. We may really want to get the roads right before we then try to start putting in all kinds of other services that may be much more costly when the state faces such high transportation costs. I've already made the sort of third point, which is that the impacts of infrastructure and urbanization are likely to be grossly underestimated, because the fact is that many of these returns are going to accrue in the very long run, and we're not going to pick them up very well in the short run. But I think as researchers, what we can do is try to look at short-run indicators that these long-run investments are in fact being made. And let me just touch on 4 things very fast that I think we really, really don't understand well. One is short-term migration. It's a huge phenomenon in India, and almost no survey asks about it. When they do, they're not spatially disaggregated, and we really don't understand what's happening here. But it has huge implications for policy. So right now, policy treats you based on where you're considered permanently resident. I think that's a huge friction when it comes to the movement of people. People are moving anyway, but they're giving up all kinds of access to goods and services when they do that. I touched on the complementarity of infrastructure investments. Let me just get down to 3 and 4. So, all right, determinants of urban success. We do not understand why some cities in India are doing so much better than others, why some are growing so much faster than others. And I think a lot more research needs to be done on this, and we have the data to do it. And finally, the last one is intra-urban policy. We talked about infrastructure, we talked about floor area ratios, we talked about zoning. All of these things are the actual decisions that cities make to shape economic activity in these areas, and we don't understand what the local effects are at all. It requires higher spatial resolution data, but it actually does exist out there. So thank you very much.